Sure. So first I want to thank you all for coming, and thanks Stevenson University for hosting. We've got environmental noise over there, and the kitchen's over there. So I will try and project. So the title of my paper is The Hollow Plantain Stem, Shame, Masculinity, and the Stability of Empire in Death and the King's Horseman. Among post-colonial plays, few have received more fame or critical attention than Wole Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman. Partially, the play appeals to critics because it attempts to work through, in dramatic form, issues of cultural hybridity that have become central to post-colonial theory through the work of Homi Bhabha. Death explores the intersections of British and Yoruba culture in Nigeria, forcing the audience to consider the possibilities and problems of a post-colonial society existing liminally between African traditions and British imperial culture. Many of the characters from both cultural backgrounds resist this liminality, this hybridity, in an attempt to maintain a dualism between Yoruba and British, black and white. This paper examines how the play's Yoruba women enforce cultural divisions through a rhetoric of shaming, equating hybridity with lost masculinity. Amusa and Elisine, two of the male characters, are mocked for being unmanly. And this mockery relies on shaming to discipline and police the porous boundaries between Yoruba culture and British imperialism, as well as between the genders, maintaining what Frantz Fanon calls Manichaeism, essential dualisms whose sides remain continuously in conflict. In Death and the King's Horseman, the marketplace represents the cultural space of traditional Yoruba values, and it's a space dominated by women. It's a space largely controlled by Ialoja, the sort of main female character, but fiercely defended by all of the women and girls, as Amusa, who's the native administration sergeant, discovers when he enters the marketplace at the opening of scene 3. Although Amusa and his two constables are armed with batons, they quickly fall victim to the women's mockery. And it's a mockery that equates working for the British with emasculation. The taunt of eunuch recurs throughout the scene, beginning with the first woman who speaks, referring to Amusa as, "You white man's eunuch." Another woman grabs his police baton and says, "That doesn't fool anyone, you know. It's the one you carry under your government knickers that counts." And after Amusa refuses to let them see up his shorts, the women assert that he had to be castrated before he could become a policeman. Throughout the scene, the women insult Amusa as a eunuch, impotent, and unmanly, until the girls decide that they're going to strip the constables of their uniform shorts, thereby exposing the men as impotent. If not sexually impotent, at least unable to assert their dominance over the marketplace. This emasculating rhetoric is continually linked to Amusa's government service. It is his government knickers that hide his eunuchhood. Because Amusa has sold out by joining the British administration, rather than remaining firmly in his own Yoruba traditions, he has lost his masculinity in the eyes of the market women. And of course, the implicit fear here is that a castrated Yoruba male will lead to a castrated Yoruba culture. Let's set that aside. In the final scene, Ialoja reprises this same kind of emasculating rhetoric after Elisine Oba, the King's Horseman, has failed to commit his ritual suicide at the appointed time. Like Amusa, Elisine's emasculation is linked to his failure to fulfill his duty, a failure which destabilizes the Yoruba universe. And anybody who knows Death and the King's Horseman, there's a whole bunch of scholarship on that, so I'm not going to touch it. Although we can talk about it in discussion if you want. Elisine acknowledges his failure and shame even before Ialoja arrives, though crucially he maintains his sexual potency. Elisine tells Pilkings, the British district officer, "The contempt of my own son rescued something of my shame at your hands. You've stopped me in my duty, but I know now that I did give birth to a son." Elisine asserts his fatherhood, his ability to create a son, and thereby implicitly his own sexual potency. Even if he is disgraced, Elisine has produced a son who is a man and who is not shameful. In contrast, when Ialoja arrives to see Elisine in the British prison, she asserts his impotence. Now, in the play's first scene, Elisine took a new bride in order to leave behind a child before his ritual suicide took him into the other world. But in prison, Elogia scoffs at the idea that Elusine could father a child. She berates him, "Oh, you self-vaunted stem of the plantain, how hollow it all proves. The pith is gone in the parent stem, so how will it prove with the new shoot?" Elogia's doubts about Elusine's potency contrast sharply with the first scene of the play, when Elusine is repeatedly referred to as a father by Elogia and the praise singer. In the first scene, in honor of his responsibility to maintain the stability of the Yoruba world through his self-sacrifice, Elogia and the market women call Elusine the father of us all. But in scene 5, after he's failed to carry out the ritual, Elusine's hollow, pithless Plantain puts him in the same emasculated sphere as the rhetorically castrated Amusa. Both face a rhetoric belittling them as men because they are, rightly or wrongly, thought to have adopted liminal positions between Yoruba and British cultures. Homi Bhabha discusses liminality or cultural hybridity as one of the central components of post-colonial identity. After colonization, cultures are neither able to return to their pre-colonial culture, nor are they able to fully assimilate and genuinely reproduce the culture of the colonizing power. Bhabha explains that this in-betweenness, this existence on the borders of, for example, Yoruba and British culture, creates a new cultural space of possibility. He writes, "This interstitial passage between fixed identifications opens up the possibility of a cultural hybridity that entertains difference without an assumed or imposed hierarchy. I argue that both Amusa and Elusine occupy culturally interstitial spaces, neither Yoruba nor British, but a hybrid of both. Although Elusine's hybridity is slightly different, which I'll discuss in just a moment. Death makes Amusa's hybrid position very clear. He engages in what Bhabha refers to as mimicry. Bhabha explains, colonial mimicry is the desire for a reformed, recognizable other, as a subject of a difference that is almost the same but not quite, which is to say that the discourse of mimicry is constructed around an ambivalence. In order to be effective, mimicry must continually produce its slippage, its excess, its difference. As a figure neither Yoruba nor British, Amusa is continually performing both. As a figure neither Yoruba nor British, Amusa is continually performing both Britishness and Yoruba-ness, and his performances reveal the incompleteness of both identities. Even as Amusa is mocked and emasculated by the Yoruba market women for being too British, the colonial authorities continue to regard him as a native, and therefore non-British. When Amusa reports that his men were driven from the market in ignominious defeat, the resident notices that the constables are missing the sashes from their uniforms, and he remarks, "I recommended them myself in my young days in the service. A bit of color always appeals to the natives." Although a member of the British colonial establishment working to maintain imperial control in Nigeria, this passing comment reveals that Amusa still retains the status of native, that is, of other. The very fact of wearing the governmental native administration uniform physically marks Amusa as other. It signifies his status as a native that can be easily controlled by giving him a colorful sash, which is, of course, an opinion characteristic of colonial conceptions of indigenous peoples. On the other hand, Elusine's status as a liminal figure is not as clear as Amusa's, mainly because of the ambivalence and purposeful obscurity of Elusine's failure to kill himself. We do not see Elusine's arrest, which prevents the ritual, and the hints that the play gives us do not make clear whether it was Elusine's personal failure or the arrival of Pilkings and the police that prevented the horseman's death. Elusine implies that Pilkings stopped him, saying, "I am stopped from fulfilling my destiny." The passive phrasing here suggests that Elusine would have completed the ritual if Pilkings hadn't arrived at the moment right before death. And Pilkings seems only too willing to take credit for what he sees as saving Elusine's life. When Elogia arrives, however, she provides a distinctly different version of events. She does that a lot. In Elogia's account, Elusine faltered and turned away from his duty because he had become too attached to the pleasures of the marketplace, which is again the domain of women, undermining further Elusine's masculinity. Eologia says, the bush rat fled his rightful cause, reached the market and set up a lamentation, please save me. Are these fitting words to hear from an ancestral mask? When Eologia describes what happened, Pilkings plays no role in Ellisine's failure, but the responsibility rests entirely with the Horseman. Although it's unclear to what extent, if any, Ellisine has become identified with the British colonizers, he comes to occupy an interstitial space between life and death, a man who should be dead but still lives. Failing to fulfill his role places Ellisine in a cultural space equivalent to that of eunuchs and impotent semi-men occupied by a Musa. Emasculating rhetoric, a rhetoric intended specifically to shame men, is deployed purposefully against both Amusa and Ellisine. The shaming is not incidental. Shame is a socially structured discourse that enforces behavioral norms because one avoids the negative affective experience of shame by behaving properly. Shame isolates the individual, and emasculation and sexual embarrassment are among the most effective ways of shaming men in heteronormative cultures. You might think of the Abu Ghraib photographs. Of the disconcerting relationship between shame and identity, Eve Kozovsky-Sedgwick writes, shame and identity remain in very dynamic relation to one another, at once deconstituting and foundational, because shame is both peculiarly contagious and peculiarly individuating. In other words, shame disrupts and unsettles the individual identity. Shame is therefore a way of disciplining behavior, and in Death and the King's Horseman, the shaming rhetoric of emasculation tries to discipline Yoruba men to remain within their culturally sanctioned roles. In other words, this rhetoric tries to reject the liminal or hybrid positions opened up by cultural contact in favor of a more distinct binary between colonizer and colonized. This binaristic worldview is closer to the Manichaeism theorized by Frantz Fanon than to Baba's cultural hybridity. Fanon writes, decolonization is the meeting of two forces, opposed to each other by their very nature. One of the premises of Fanon's theory is that colonizer and colonized, black and white, must always be in conflict with one another. The entire history of colonialism was structured through racial violence, and racial, cultural, and social violence must remain a fundamental part of the experience of decolonization, at least for Fanon. Fanon does, however, acknowledge the intimate and originary relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. He writes, it is the settler who has brought the native into existence and who perpetuates his existence. The settler owes the very fact of his existence, that is to say, his property, to the colonial system. Although this mutual creation seems to open the door to a theory of hybridity, Fanon maintains that the fundamental relationship between settlers and natives is one of violence. Coming from a Marxist tradition, Fanon focuses on conflict as the structuring fact of existence in a colonial or post-colonial culture, and the fact of the conflict requires two opposed forces clearly delineated from one another. The emasculating rhetoric of Eologia and the Market Women seems to be aimed at preserving this kind of binaristic system, maintaining a clear dualism between the British and the Yoruba. The punishment for entering a liminal space is a loss of masculinity and the respect that goes with it. Now, before I wrap up this brief presentation, I want to clarify how I locate Soyinka's project in terms of these conflicting positions. Although Ellisine is not entirely an admirable character, and Amusa is far from admirable, I think Soyinka is more sympathetic to their liminal identities than to the position of the market women. Many have critiqued Soyinka for his Westernism, but I think that in Death and the King's Horseman, his project is to explore liberatory possibilities opened up by liminal spaces, interstitial spaces between both contending cultural zones and gender binaries. The figure of the eunuch haunts the play, working, I think, to parallel the hybrid positions between Yoruba and British culture. These positions offer possibilities to resist the oppressions of both colonialism and conservative heteronormative gender binaries. Thank you.